Before we start, let me tell you something slowly. You're in WinOwl, a little corner where we don't come to sugarcoat life, but to look it straight in the eye, with all its cracks. Here we tell stories that hurt, that make you uncomfortable, but that can also open your eyes. If you like listening to stories that feel more like a confession than a fairy tale, I invite you to subscribe right now to the WinOwl channel, to like this video, and to share it with someone who needs to think about what they're doing with their family, with their life, with their inheritance. Today I'm going to tell you the story of a 72-year-old man whose own children beat him and locked him up to force a signature out of him, so they could sell the land where he had broken his back his whole life. I'm going to talk to you about a fruit farm called La Isla, about a neighborhood community that watched from a distance, and about how, between greed and neglect, that man had to decide whether to die as a victim or leave behind a different kind of legacy. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but I can promise you that after you hear this, you might look at your father, your mother, or even your own children a little differently. If you haven't yet, subscribe, hit that like button, and share this story. Because what I'm about to tell you is no fairy tale, it's almost a testimony. And you might not like what you discover about yourself while you listen. This is me speaking, Rafael. I'm 72 years old, and yes, I was beaten and locked up by my own children. Let me ask you something before we go on. If your children did something like that to you, would you forgive them, or would you close the door on them forever? I ask because that's the question that haunts me every night. The farm is called La Isla because when we bought it, more than 40 years ago, everything around it was nothing but dirt and dust. It's not like that anymore. The city grew, the state of houses and buildings crept closer like a slow tide, and one day I woke up and realized La Isla wasn't so alone anymore. Right next door there was a gated community, with its electric gates, its gardeners, kids on bikes, and little dogs on short leashes. I was always the old man from the farm. The fruit tree guy. The one who came out every morning in a hat, cotton shirt, and hands stained with soil. Few people knew my name. For most, I was just Don Rafael, the man from the farm. I'd lived alone ever since my wife, Elena, passed away. My children, Mateo and Sofía, had left for the city years earlier. Careers, offices, air conditioning, modern life. They came by every now and then, mostly when they needed money. Has that ever happened to you? That your family only seems to remember your phone number when they're short on cash? I won't lie, I spoiled them for a long time. I told myself it was my duty as a father, that I'd worked for this, that I was already on my way out. I was fooling myself, because deep down what I really had was fear of being left completely alone, of La Isla becoming the perfect stage for my abandonment. I'm telling you this because betrayals don't begin the day they hit you or the day they shout at you. They start much earlier. They start with silences. One day, offers started coming in for the farm. A real estate company, some consortium, a firm from who knows where. They came with color renderings, smiles, and promises. They talked to me about residences, a shopping center, about increasing the value of the area. I listened without even offering them coffee. I always told them the same thing. La Isla is not for sale. My children didn't see it that way. Mateo was the first to push. He came one Sunday in a rental car, wearing sunglasses, clutching a phone he never put down. He walked among the trees like he no longer remembered how to step on soil. He talked about numbers, about figures I had never seen together on a single piece of paper. Dad, it's a lot of money. You could move into a nice apartment, with an elevator, with 24-hour security. You don't have to stay here breaking your back. Sofía backed him up a few days later, over a video call. She spoke more softly, but her eyes were just as hard. We could split the money, Dad. You'd be fine, we'd be fine too. It's the logical thing to do. Logical? Maybe. But logic doesn't understand roots. Let me ask you something. If you had a piece of land where you buried your wife, where you watched your children grow up, where you planted every tree with your own hands, would you sell it, even if they offered you a fortune? I couldn't. Or maybe I just wouldn't, which is not the same thing. In the community next door, over the years, I got to know a few people. Not because I was very sociable, but because the land forces people to cross paths. There was a small neighborhood association that, every now and then, bought fruit from me for their events, their fairs, the community kitchens they ran. That's where I saw her again, after so many years, Claudia. Claudia had been part of my youth. Not exactly a proper girlfriend, but one of those almost somethings that never get a real name. When I married Elena, Claudia left to study in another city. I never heard from her again. And suddenly, at a community meeting, there she was on the other side of the table, her hair now streaked with gray, her eyes just as bright, and that way of smiling that always looked like an apology for something. "Rafa," she said, as if half a century hadn't gone by. She didn't hug me right away. She came closer slowly and rested her hand on my arm, her palm warm, steady. Her perfume was light, like good soap and tangerine. I felt a strange warmth in my chest, something I thought had gone out long ago. She looked at me up close, too close for my age, for propriety, for that widowhood you wear like a coat. And yet, I didn't step back. "You're just as stubborn," she said. "They told me you don't want to sell." We both laughed. It was a soft, restrained laugh, but there was a current running underneath it. Have you ever felt that? That quiet tension that doesn't need words, just small distances. Claudia was now working with the community on children's programs. Tutoring classes, reading workshops. She told me they were looking for more space, that sometimes the classrooms were too small for all the kids. "And you have all this land right next door," she said, letting the sentence hang in the air. She didn't push. She just left the idea floating between us while her fingers stayed resting on my arm a second longer than necessary. I felt her skin, that light weight, and caught myself leaning just a little closer to her, breathing in her air. I was the one who pulled away first. At my age, you learn to be wary even of the good moments. The weeks went by, and the pressure from my children grew. The calls started coming with that uncomfortable tone, those little guilt trips. "Dad, don't be selfish. You're not thinking about our future. What's the point of clinging to that farm if you're already old? What would you have done, honestly? Would you have stood your ground, or would you have signed just so they'd finally stop insisting?" One afternoon, Mateo and Sofía showed up together. That alone was unusual. They came in serious, dressed a little too nicely for a casual visit. They walked into the kitchen without greeting the trees, without looking around. They had a folder with them, and that energy of someone coming to close a deal, not to visit their father. "There's something we need to talk about," Mateo said, dropping the folder on the table. They explained that the real estate company was pushing for a decision, that the offer could fall through, that this was the perfect moment to sell. Sofía took my hand and squeezed it hard. Her fingers were cold. "Dad, we don't want to make this difficult. Just sign." I looked at the papers. I didn't understand half of the clauses, but I understood enough. If I signed, La Isla would stop being mine. Stop being anyone's, really. It would become a project. Square meters. Brochures, swimming pools. I took a deep breath, set the pen down on the table, and said, in the calmest voice I could manage, "I'm not going to sign." Everything froze. Mateo looked at me like I was a spoiled child. Sofía slowly pulled her hand back. "Dad, you don't understand," she said. "We need that money." "I'm not going to sign," I repeated. That was the first visible crack. Mateo slammed his fist on the table, something he'd never done as a boy. Sofía raised her voice. Old resentments came spilling out, arguments saved up for years, lines like "You were never there, you chose the farm over us." I won't bore you with every insult, but there's one that still cuts. "Selfish old man." I didn't shout. I simply got up, took the folder, closed it, and set it on the shelf. "As long as I'm alive," I said, "this land is not for sale." Maybe I sounded harsher than I thought. Maybe they heard it as a challenge. Things calmed down on the surface. That evening we had dinner together, as if nothing had happened. Sofía cooked, Mateo pretended to be distracted by his phone. I, on the inside, was watching every gesture. I could feel something twisted in the air. I'd learned, over the years, that when someone wants your money and can't get you to hand it over cleanly, they start thinking of other ways. That night, what I never imagined happened. And yet some part of me had imagined it, because I left my cell phone in my shirt pocket, recording. Tell me something, would you be capable of recording your own children out of sheer distrust? They thought they were catching me off guard. They waited until I went to bed. I'm usually a light sleeper, but that day the exhaustion weighed on me like lead. I felt the bed dip slightly, heard soft footsteps. Then, the smell of alcohol. It's for his own good, I heard Sophia's voice whisper. I tried to sit up, but it was already too late. A damp cloth, that sharp, penetrating smell, and the darkness came fast, like someone switching me off from the inside. I barely managed to hear Mateo say, "It'll just be for a little while, until he signs." I don't know how much time passed. The next thing I remember is the cold of the floor against my cheek and the smell of old wood. The back room of the shed. I was tied to a chair, my wrists raw from the rope, my mouth dry. I had a blow on my eyebrow, maybe I'd fought back, maybe I'd just fallen. The door was locked from the outside with a padlock. Can you imagine waking up like that, knowing it wasn't a stranger who kidnapped you, but your own children? I could dramatize it and tell you I cried, that I screamed. But it wasn't like that. What I felt was closer to a cold emptiness, a kind of frozen calm. As if my heart had sat down on a rock just to watch. I heard their voices on the other side, muffled. They were on the phone with someone, maybe the lawyer, maybe the real estate people. I could pick out fragments. "We've got him, it's just a matter of getting him to sign, he's not going to report us, he's our father." Me, in that chair, I started to think. I remembered Elena, the first trees we planted. I remembered Claudia, her warm hand on my arm. I remembered the neighborhood kids riding their little bikes, faces pressed against the fence. And I asked myself another question: what's the point of living 72 years if, at the key moment, you don't use everything you've learned for something more than just crying? The first time they came into the shed, Mateo was holding the folder, Sofía had a bottle of water and a carefully arranged look of concern. "Dad, I'm sorry, but you're forcing us to do this," she said. "Sign and we'll let you go." They put the pen in my hand. The ropes allowed me a bit of movement. I felt my pulse tremble, not from fear, but from contained rage. "I'm not afraid of you," I said slowly. "But you should start being afraid of yourselves." Mateo snorted, nervous. He hit my shoulder with an open hand, not very hard, but enough to draw a line. Sofía grabbed my chin, lifted my face, and looked me in the eyes as if she were searching for some trace of pity she was never going to find. "Sign, Dad," she repeated. The pen touched the paper. I made slow, crooked strokes. They were too anxious to notice that I didn't actually complete anything, that my signature that day was a useless scrawl. Either way, they weren't going to be able to use those papers without my real will behind them. Meanwhile, in my pocket, somewhere in the wrinkled shirt they'd left on me, the phone kept recording. The whole argument, the threats, their own voices saying they had me, everything was being saved. Do you think that was cruel of me? Or did I just defend myself with the only weapon I had? At some point, maybe they thought they'd finally broken me. They left me tied to the chair, with the promise that the next day we'd sort everything out. The padlock clanked again. Their footsteps faded away. There are things you only learn by living in the countryside. One of them is that almost no door is completely closed if you have patience, and if you remember where the wood creaks. The shed had a small, high window, with old, half-rusted bars. I'd installed them myself years ago. I remembered that one of them was loose. That memory, that tiny detail, was my salvation. It took me hours, or that's how it felt. I rubbed the rope against the metal edge, against a splinter. My skin split open, I felt the warm blood run down my wrist. The pain kept me awake, sharp. When the rope finally gave way, my hands were like two wounded animals, but they were free. I stood up on shaky legs. I looked for a box and dragged it under the window. I climbed on top, my body protested. I pushed the loose bar with all the strength I had left until it gave way with a groan of iron. The air outside smelled of damp earth and leaves. Never in my life had a smell seemed so clean. I scraped my back, my chest, my side, trying to squeeze through that ridiculous gap. For a second I thought I was going to get stuck, like in some grotesque scene. But an old body, when it wants to survive, becomes elastic in unexpected ways. I fell on the other side, into the grass and some crates. The sky was already beginning to lighten. I didn't scream. I didn't run around like a madman. I just breathed, felt the mud in my hands, and knew I still had one thing on my side: time. The community next door was starting to wake up. You could hear a car somewhere, a dog barking. I walked along the fence until I reached the small gate we'd improvised years ago to pass boxes of fruit through without having to go all the way around the block. I knew Claudia sometimes went out early. And there she was. In a light sweatshirt, her hair tied back, a thermos in her hand. When she saw me, she froze. Then her eyes dropped to my wrists, the dried blood, the torn shirt. She ran over. "Rafa, what did they do to you?" she asked, in a low voice, as if she already knew the answer and only wanted to give me space. When she put her hands on my wrists, I felt that warmth again. Her fingers were firm, but they trembled a little. She pulled me closer, almost holding me by the waist, and for a second my chest pressed against hers. I noticed the fast rhythm of her breathing, the smell of clean sweat mixed with perfume. I know it sounds strange to say it, but in that moment, between pain and humiliation, there was also a flicker of life. A kind of awakening that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with feeling someone touch you without trying to take anything from you. "You're coming with me," she said. "And you're going to tell me everything." In her apartment, she sat me down in a kitchen chair. The place smelled of fresh coffee and toast. Morning light slid in through the window, cutting the air into golden strips. Claudia cleaned my wounds with a delicacy that completely disarmed me. Every time she passed the cotton over torn skin, she looked me in the eyes to see if I could take it. Her fingers lingered a few seconds too long on the back of my hand, on my forearm. I felt the heat rise not just from the cut, but all the way up my arm. "Does it hurt a lot?" she whispered, so close her breath brushed my cheek. I don't know if I was answering about the wounds or something else when I said, "Less than it should." We stayed quiet for a moment, with that heavy closeness between us. I could see the gentle line of her neck, a loose strand of hair stuck to her temple. A drop of disinfectant slid cold along my skin, and at the same time, everywhere her hand rested, everything burned. "Do you think it's ridiculous that at 72 years old, the body still wakes up like that from a sincere touch?" I told her everything. From the pressure my children had been putting on me to the night in the shed, the cloth that smelled of alcohol, the rope, the window. She listened without cutting in, except to ask short, precise questions. Claudia wasn't just a good woman, she was an organized woman, with a clear, cool head. "Do you have any proof of what they did?" she asked at the end. That's when I remembered the phone. I pulled it from my pocket with clumsy hands. The screen was cracked, but it was still on. I went into the voice recorder. The file was there, several hours long. We played a stretch of it. You could hear Sofia's voice saying, "You're forcing us to do this." Mateo's voice, saying, "No one's going to report us." You could hear my ragged breathing, the blow, my refusals. Claudia looked at me with something that resembled sad admiration. "You did the right thing recording this," she said. "And you have to do something with it." What would you have done in my place? Would you have sent them to prison? Would you have hidden everything out of shame? Claudia put me in touch with some old colleagues, people I'd known in my youth when I was still working, before I dedicated myself fully to the farm. A lawyer, a retired journalist who now helped out with community projects, a teacher who knew a lot about elder issues and abuse. We met in the community hall that night. It was a simple place, plastic chairs, a whiteboard on the wall, the smell of old disinfectant. But that night, for me, it felt like a war room. I played them the recording. No one spoke while my children's voices filled the room. When it ended, there was a heavy silence. The lawyer was the first one to say anything. With this, if you want, you can go to the police, to court, wherever. It's a clear case of violence and coercion. I took a deep breath. The thought of seeing my children with handcuffs on their wrists turned my stomach. I don't want to destroy their lives, I said. But I'm not going to let them keep trampling mine either. That's when the journalist, Joaquin, suggested something else. Don't underestimate the power of showing them you're not alone, he said. Sometimes the worst punishment is being forced to look at yourself from the outside, with no mask. That's how the plan was born. For a few days, I pretended to still be kidnapped inside the same story they'd made up. I didn't answer their calls. I let them get nervous, let them sit with the idea that I was still tied to a chair, when in reality I was sitting among people who were on my side. Meanwhile, with the lawyer's help, I drafted a document, not a sale, but a shield. A new will that made it very clear that La Isla would not be sold, but destined for something else. Claudia was essential in that decision. One afternoon, while we went over paperwork at her table, surrounded by cold coffee cups and pencils scattered everywhere, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with that mixture of tenderness and resolve that always undoes me. Rafa, what do you want to happen to this land when you're no longer here? She asked. The question landed heavy. I could have said anything, leave it to an institution, divide it into plots, hand it over to the state. But what came to mind were the children's laughter, their voices at recess, the bikes, the balls that sometimes bounced over to my side of the fence. I wanted to keep giving life, I said. Claudia smiled, slowly. She moved closer, one hand on the table, the other on my shoulder. I felt the warmth of her chest close to my arm, the soft brush of her hip against the edge of the table, as if the space between us had shrunk. Then turn it into that, she whispered. Into life. I don't know if it was the way she said it or the closeness, but something in me loosened. I took her hand and squeezed it with a strength I hadn't used in years. She didn't pull away. On the contrary, she leaned in a little more, and her forehead brushed mine. For a second, the whole world was just that warm contact, the smell of her skin, our breath mingling. I didn't kiss her. There was no need. At our age, some things speak louder through a slow touch than through a burst of passion. Do you think an old man can't fall in love again? Together, we decided that the shed on the farm would be turned into a learning center for the children of the community. Tutoring classes, garden workshops, reading spaces. The land my children wanted to turn into cash would become notebooks, small hands touching soil for the first time. We had everything written up legally. I made sure it stated that Mateo and Sofía would have no say in it, no power to sell, interfere, or claim. That while I was alive, and after my death, La Isla would be a place of learning and refuge. The next step was the confrontation. I called my children to the farm, as if I had finally given in. I texted them saying we needed to talk about the future of the land. They came quickly, with the eagerness of someone who smells victory. When they arrived, they found something they weren't expecting, the community. Claudia, Joaquin, the lawyer, several neighbors. And me, standing in front of the shed, my hands bandaged but steady. What is all this, Dad? Sofía asked, looking around, uneasy. Mateo tensed up, like a cornered animal. I took out my phone. I didn't shout, didn't throw dramatic lines at them. I simply pressed play. Their own voices filled the late afternoon air. Their words, their excuses, the blow, my refusal. The neighbors listened in silence. There was no voyeurism, just a kind of shared sadness. Mateo went pale. Sofía started crying, but without tears, just that shattered expression of someone who, for the first time, sees themselves from the outside and doesn't like what they see. Dad, She began. Don't speak, I said. You already did, right there. I paused the recording. The silence that followed was dense. I felt strangely calm. The pain was still there, but tamed, like an animal sitting quietly at my side. I didn't bring you here to press charges, I went on. Not yet. But I want you to understand something, I am not your hostage. And this land isn't either. I told them then about the new will, the learning center, the agreements with the community. That there would be no sale, no money to split, no apartments with pools. You locked me in a shed to force a signature out of me, I said, without raising my voice. Today I'm the one shutting you out of my life to protect something much bigger than a piece of paper. Mateo took a step forward. For a moment I thought he was going to lunge at me like that night. But the eyes of the neighbors, of Claudia, of Joaquin, held him back. It was the first time my children didn't have privacy as a shield. You're going to leave us with nothing? He spat, furious. That's what you do as a father? I drew a long breath. I'm not leaving you with nothing, I answered. I'm leaving you with your conscience. What you do with it is your problem. Sofía covered her mouth with her hand, murmuring something like, I'm sorry, Dad, we didn't mean. I looked at her, and inside me one part was breaking, but the other stayed standing. You're going to leave here today, I said. And don't come back until you understand that I am not a bank account. If you set foot on La Isla again without my permission, this time I will go to the police with everything. Do you think I was too harsh? Or too soft? I watched them leave, their pride in shreds. No one insulted them. No one clapped. We just watched them go, each one alone with their own shadow. After that came the rebuilding. Turning the shed into a learning center was almost like therapy. We cleared out the old junk, the broken furniture, the stale smell. We painted the walls in light colors. Claudia organized shelves for books. The children of the community, with their small hands, helped plant new rows of trees all around, each one with their name on a little wooden sign. The first time I saw a group of kids sitting on the floor of the shed, no longer a shed, but a classroom, listening to a story, I felt something close to peace. Not full happiness, because what had happened with my children still hurt. But it was meaning. Claudia moved between the tables, correcting exercises, leaning over their notebooks. Sometimes her blouse would fall open just a little as she bent down, revealing the soft curve of her chest, and I'd look away out of respect and modesty, but there were moments when she seemed to notice, because she'd lift her gaze, catch mine, and smile just a little, as if to say, yes, we're alive. Don't forget it. One afternoon, after the kids had gone, we stayed alone in the center. The sun was coming in low through the new windows, turning everything orange. I was putting boxes away, she was cleaning the board. Suddenly she stopped, leaned against the doorframe, and looked at me in silence. Do you regret what you did with your children? She asked. It took me a moment to answer. I regret a lot of things I did before, I said. The silences, not setting boundaries in time, being more of a provider than a father. This I'm still not sure. Claudia walked toward me, slowly. She placed a hand on my chest, right where the heart sometimes starts racing without asking permission. The fabric of my shirt was thin, I felt the pressure of her palm, the warmth seeping through everything. What you're doing with this land now, she whispered, is also a way of being a father. Maybe not for them, but for many others. Her body was just a few centimeters from mine. I could feel her breath against my neck, the light touch of her forehead against my own. My hands, that had spent so long holding nothing but tools, ended up resting at her waist, gently, as if she might break. We stayed like that, unhurried, breathing together. There were no big declarations or promises. Just that contact, that still possible right to affection, to quiet desire. Is it wrong that, after so much pain, there's still room for something like that? I heard little about Mateo and Sofía after that. They sent me a few messages, long ones, full of explanations, half confessions. We didn't know what we were doing. I didn't answer at first. I needed that silence. In time, I sent them a short note. I'm alive. The farm too. When you want to really talk, without money in between, I'm here. But don't come to negotiate land. Come to talk about what we broke. I don't know if they ever will. I don't know if there'll ever be a full reconciliation, or just some kind of truce. At my age, I've learned that not every story gets a neat ending. Some remain open, like a scar that sometimes aches in the cold. What I do know is that every morning, when I walk among the trees of La Isla, I now hear two kinds of sound: the leaves moving in the wind, and the children laughing in the old shed. And I think that, in the end, I won in the only way that mattered to me. The land didn't end up in the hands of greed, but in small, curious hands that might one day understand that this place exists because an old man refused to sign. Sometimes I sit on a wooden bench in front of the center, late in the afternoon. Claudia sits down beside me. We don't always talk. Sometimes her head rests on my shoulder, and my hand, without thinking too much, settles on her leg, feeling the warmth of her skin through the fabric. It's a simple contact, almost invisible, but to me it's a luxury. Does it still hurt? She asked me one day, without specifying whether she meant my hands, my chest, or my children. Yes, I answered. But I've learned to look pain in the eye, not to hide it. And in that sentence, I think, is everything I wanted to tell you. I don't know if I did the right thing. I don't know if I was too harsh or too late. That's why I'm asking you, the one listening to this, what would you have done in my place? Would you have reported your children? Would you have let them back into your home, into your life? Do you think a father is obliged to forgive, always, without conditions? I want to read what you think. I want you to tell me in the comments what you would do with that farm, with that recording, with that betrayal. What advice you'd give to a man like me, who found care in his community and abandonment in his own blood. And if this story stirred something inside you, if it made you look at your family differently, I invite you to say that too. Subscribe to the WinOwl channel, leave your like, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that not everything can be bought or sold, not even at 72. Because in the end, land, love, and dignity have a lot in common. You tend them, you work them, and if you give them up because you're pressured, it's very hard to get them back.